a line has been drawn at the bottom of the largest water reservoir in the United States. It is not an administrative boundary or a political compromise. It is a number: 895 feet. As of this week, July 12, 2026, the surface of Lake Mead sits at 1,042.81 feet above sea level. It has over 147 feet left to fall. But in the cold, hard mathematics of institutional hydrology, that is no longer a buffer. It is a countdown. 40 million people across 7 states in northern Mexico depend on the water stored behind Hoover Dam. 5.5 million acres of agriculture are irrigated with it. Cities like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas are built on its promise. And now that promise is being foreclosed upon by a crisis that is not just about drought, but about a century-old error in arithmetic. The system was designed to fail. We are now living inside that failure. But here is the detail that tells the real story. In mid-June of 2026, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation issued its latest projections. Its 24-month study. Federal hydrologists, the people who manage the flow of water for the American West, warned that by July of next year, 2027, Lake Mead's surface could plunge to a level between 1,015 and 1,020 feet. A catastrophic new record. This is no longer a slow-motion train wreck. The wreck is accelerating. And the clock measuring the distance to impact is not a calendar. It is the height of the water above a concrete intake at the bottom of a dam. The strangest part of this story is not that Lake Mead is shrinking. It is what happens when it crosses the lines it is now approaching, and who will be left with water when it does. To understand what is happening, you have to understand the dam and the different kinds of empty. Hoover Dam is not a simple wall. It is a complex machine with carefully calibrated thresholds. The first of these is the minimum power pool. For decades, that number was 1,050 feet. In 2016, after installing new wide-head turbines, the Bureau of Reclamation lowered it. The new number is 950 feet. Below that elevation, the pressure is too low for the turbines to safely generate hydroelectric power for millions of people in Nevada, Arizona, and California. But running them even close to that 950 mark pushes the machinery into a dangerous rough zone of vibration and cavitation, where air bubbles implode with enough force to scar solid steel. Dropping below 950 feet does not just mean the lights go out. It means the dam itself is at risk. Then there is the second line, the final one, 895 feet of elevation. Dead pool. This is the part the headlines do not capture. Dead pool does not mean the lake is empty. At 895 feet, there would still be millions of acre-feet of water sitting in the deepest parts of the reservoir. A vast, inaccessible lake locked at the bottom of the basin. But its surface would have fallen below the dam's lowest water intake. Gravity would no longer be able to pull a single drop through the penstocks. The river below the dam, the river that supplies California, Arizona, and Mexico, would cease to flow. In that scenario, the state of California loses access to its single largest source of water. Central Arizona's shimmering canals run dry. And the nation of Mexico, the last user on the river, is cut off entirely. The southern half of the American West as we know it would enter an economic and humanitarian crisis with no modern precedent. And yet, one city would still be drinking. This is the part nobody is putting on the news. In 2015, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency for Las Vegas, completed work on Intake No. 3. It is a 3-mile-long tunnel drilled through solid rock deep beneath Lake Mead's floor. In 2020, they finished its companion piece, a subterranean low lake level pumping station. The total cost was $5 billion. It is a doomsday machine, a deep straw. If and when Lake Mead hits dead pool, when Hoover Dam's gates are rendered useless, and the states downstream are facing a physical cutoff, Las Vegas will simply turn on its pumps and begin pulling water directly from the bottom of the dying lake. The city most associated with American excess has quietly engineered the most secure water supply in the entire desert, while its neighbors face oblivion. Zoom out, and the history makes the mechanism of this collapse clear. The crisis was born on November 24, 1922. That was the day the Colorado River Compact was signed. Negotiators from 7 states gathered to divide the river, apportioning its flow between an upper basin of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, and a lower basin of Arizona, California, and Nevada. Their goal was to prevent endless litigation and secure a future of orderly growth. They based their numbers on the best data they had, and their data was wrong. The early 20th century was one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years of the American West's climate history. The negotiators saw a river running high and assumed it was normal. They allocated roughly 17.5 million acre-feet of water per year. The problem is, the river's true, long-term average flow is closer to 12 or 13 million acre-feet. They gave away water that did not exist. For decades, this mathematical error, this structural deficit, was masked. The upper basin states were rural. They had not built the dams, canals, and pipelines needed to use their full legal share. Their unused water flowed downstream, creating a surplus that papered over the flawed accounting. It bought the system time. Then, in the year 2000, the time ran out. A megadrought, the driest 22-year period in over a millennium, settled over the West. The Rocky Mountain snowpack, the ultimate source of the river, began to shrink. Runoff failed, year after year. The surplus vanished, and the structural deficit was exposed with brutal mathematical clarity. The reservoir, which last saw its spillways overflow in the summer of 1983, began a relentless 20-year plunge. The iconic white bathtub ring of mineral deposits staining the canyon walls grew wider, taller, a monument to water that was no longer there. By 2007, the situation was so dire the federal government intervened, imposing the Colorado River Interim Guidelines. Those guidelines created a system of shortage tiers, linking the operation of Lake Mead with its upstream counterpart, Lake Powell, in a desperate attempt to keep both from crashing. It was an emergency measure, a temporary patch. And on December 31st of this year, 2026, it expires. The entire rulebook that has governed the river for nearly 2 decades, the fragile truce that has kept 40 million people supplied with water, simply ceases to exist. Which brings us to now. To the standoff. The fight to write the new rules, the post-2026 operational guidelines, has become one of the most fraught environmental negotiations in American history. In one corner, you have the federal government, represented by Camille Calamlum-Touton, the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. It is her agency that controls the dams. It is her job to prevent a system collapse, and she has repeatedly demanded massive, unprecedented cuts from the states. In a now famous 2022 Senate hearing, she gave the states an ultimatum: find a way to conserve 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water, or the federal government would do it for them. Her actions carry the weight of federal supremacy. Her patience is wearing thin. In another corner is Arizona. Tom Bushotsky, the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, is his state's lead negotiator. Arizona holds junior water rights compared to California, meaning it gets cut first and hardest in a shortage. Bushotsky is fighting to protect not just the booming metropolis of Phoenix, but also the state's massive agricultural industry, which uses the majority of its Colorado River water. He once described the pressure of the job by comparing himself to the Greek god Atlas, holding up the world. Then he added a chilling clarification. One thing that Atlas had going for him that we don't have, Bushotsky said, is that Atlas was a god, and we are not gods. His words are not just rhetoric. They are a statement about the human limits of managing a crisis driven by climate and flawed history. Across the table sits California, the 800-pound gorilla of the basin, represented by J.B. Hamby, chairman of the Colorado River Board of California. California has the largest population and the most senior water rights. It is legally entitled to more water than Arizona and Nevada combined. For decades, California's position was simple. Our rights are ironclad. We will not give up a drop. But the scale of the crisis has forced a change. Hamby now speaks of shared sacrifice. Putting the entire burden of climate change on one basin or another will result in conflict, he stated at a recent press briefing. The conflict is already here. On May 1st of 2026, California joined Arizona and Nevada in submitting a joint proposal to the federal government. It offered 3.2 million acre-feet of tiered reductions through 2028. A massive concession. But the upper basin states immediately declared it was not enough. The fight is over. Who absorbs the pain? Who lets fields go fallow? Who tells cities to stop growing? And then there is Nevada. Las Vegas. Represented by John J. Ensminger, the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Nevada has the smallest allocation of any state in the basin, just 300,000 acre-feet a year, a fraction of what California and Arizona receive. Yet, Ensminger has become one of the most powerful and respected voices in the entire negotiation. Because while his state gets the least water, it has done the most to conserve it. His testimony before the Senate captured the emergency. "I am not a person prone to hyperbole," he said, "but I can assure you from on the ground that the ominous tenor of recent media reports is warranted." He warned that the slow-motion wreck was accelerating, and that a moment of reckoning is near. This is the state of play in July 2026. 4 key figures, representing the interests of 40 million people, locked in a room, trying to rewrite a 100-year-old contract before the buffer of water in the nation's largest reservoir disappears completely. They are not just negotiating numbers on a page. They are allocating a shortage. They are deciding the future shape of the American West. Now, here's the paradox nobody outside the basin understands. While the negotiators fight, the city of Las Vegas has already built its ark. The popular image of Vegas is one of waste. The Bellagio fountains, the lush golf courses, the sheer existence of a sprawling metropolis in the Mojave Desert. The truth is the opposite. Since the year 2000, while the megadrought was taking hold, the population of the Las Vegas Valley grew by nearly 800,000 people. And in that same period, the region's total consumption of Colorado River water fell by nearly 30%. They achieved this through a ruthless campaign of water discipline. The Southern Nevada Water Authority pays residents to rip out their lawns. It has banned all non-functional turf grass at commercial properties. Its water cops patrol neighborhoods, handing out fines for broken sprinklers and watering on the wrong day. But the real magic happens indoors. The water that flows down your sink, your shower, your toilet in a Las Vegas hotel is not lost. It flows into the city's wastewater treatment system, where it is purified to near distilled quality. Then, hundreds of millions of gallons of it are pumped back into Lake Mead every single day through a natural channel called the Las Vegas Wash. The result is that for every gallon of Colorado River water Las Vegas takes for indoor use, 99% of it returns to the lake. The city's consumption is almost a closed loop. It is a world-leading model of urban water recycling, a model born of absolute necessity. This is why John Ensminger can sit at the negotiating table with leverage. He represents a city that has already made the painful choices that other cities are only now beginning to contemplate. And he represents a city that has spent $5 billion to ensure that even if the entire system collapses, the taps in Las Vegas will not run dry. Intake No. 3 is more than an engineering marvel. It is a declaration of independence from the fate of the lower basin. It is an insurance policy against the failure of diplomacy. This focus on cities, however, obscures the real scale of the problem. If every city from Denver to San Diego turned off its taps tomorrow, If 40 million people stopped showering and watering their yards, the Colorado River would still be in a state of deficit. Because the cities are not the primary user. Not even close. Agriculture consumes between 70 and 80% of the river's water. The vast majority of that is not for fruits and vegetables that end up on American dinner tables. It is for water-intensive forage crops like alfalfa, hay, grown in some of the hottest and driest parts of the country, fields of green stretching across the desert floor, all to feed livestock. Much of it is then exported to feed cattle in other countries. We are using a vanishing river to grow cattle feed in a desert and shipping it overseas. This is the fundamental, politically toxic tension at the heart of the crisis. It is not city versus city. It is farm versus city. It is the water required to sustain a low-density agricultural economy versus the water required to sustain a high-density urban one. The Imperial Irrigation District in California alone uses more water than the entire states of Arizona and Nevada combined. One district. Primarily for agriculture. The conservation gains made by Las Vegas, the sacrifices of millions of urban residents, are dwarfed by the water poured onto a single crop. And then there is the invisible thief. The one no one can negotiate with. Evaporation. The desert sun beating down on the vast surface of Lake Mead and the lower river system vaporizes an estimated 860,000 acre-feet of water every single year. It just vanishes into the hot, dry air. To put that number in perspective, the entire state of Nevada has a legal allocation of 300,000 acre-feet a year. Evaporation steals nearly 3 times Nevada's entire share before a single drop is used by a person. So what does the future hold? The immediate forecast is bleak. The Bureau of Reclamation's June 2026 projections show the lake's decline is not just continuing, it is picking up speed. The reservoir is expected to match its all-time record low, set back on July 28, 2022, by the end of this month. From there, it is a steep drop into uncharted territory. The projections for July 2027, a plunge to between 1,015 and 1,020 feet, would leave the lake with less than a 70-foot buffer above the minimum power pool threshold of 950 feet. A few more bad winters, a few more years of failed snowpack in the Rockies, and the dam's ability to generate power becomes a real and present danger. As the water recedes, it exposes the ghosts of the past. Sunken history. A World War II-era B-29 bomber that crashed in 1948 now rests on exposed mudflats. Pleasure boats from the 1970s, long lost, have reemerged. So have human remains, some from accidental drownings. Others telling a darker story of Las Vegas's past. Bodies discovered in barrels, grim evidence of mob hits from a bygone era. The lake is giving up its secrets as it dies. The negotiations for the post-2026 world are the only hope of staving off the worst-case scenarios. But the gap between the states remains wide. The upper basin demands the lower basin take permanent structural cuts to match the river's new, drier reality. The lower basin, led by California, argues that it has already proposed historic sacrifices and that the upper basin must also limit its future water development. Everyone agrees cuts are necessary. No one agrees on whose water it is to cut. All the while, Commissioner Tootin and the federal government hold the ultimate trump card, the authority to impose a solution if the states cannot find one themselves. Such a move would undoubtedly trigger a cascade of lawsuits that could paralyze the system for years, leaving its fate in the hands of the Supreme Court. And the clock keeps ticking toward December 31st. So 3 questions hang over the entire basin tonight. What happens on January 1st, 2027, if there is no deal? Which state? Which city? Which farm will be the first to face a world where their legal right to water is superseded by the physical inability of the river to provide it? And what does it mean for the future of the American West if the engine that built it, the Colorado River, can no longer keep up with the demands placed upon it a century ago? The water that melted from a Colorado snowfield last spring is right now somewhere in Lake Powell, waiting to be released downstream. But less is arriving each year. The water level in Lake Mead, measured by sensors every hour of every day, continues its silent, inexorable fall. It is not moving at a kilometer a day in the dark. It is simply dropping. 2 feet this month, maybe 3 the next. A slow, steady retreat toward the hardline numbers of 950 and 895. The negotiators are fighting over acre feet, but the real battle is against physics, and it's a battle they are running out of time to win. The architecture of this crisis is built on layers of assumptions. The 1922 Compact assumed a wet river. The construction of Glen Canyon Dam, creating Lake Powell upstream of Lake Mead, assumed that a second massive reservoir would provide a buffer, a savings account to guarantee the legally mandated deliveries to the lower basin. For years, it did exactly that. Powell stored water during wet years and released it during dry ones, smoothing out the natural variability of the river. But the megadrought broke that system. Powell itself nearly hit dead pool in 2022, forcing emergency releases from upstream reservoirs and emergency reductions in downstream releases to Mead. The savings account was nearly overdrawn. The 2007 interim guidelines were an attempt to formalize this balancing act. They tied the two reservoirs together with a set of intricate rules. If Powell was high and Mead was low, Powell would release extra water. If Mead was high and Powell was low, releases would be cut back. It was a complex dance of equalization, designed to keep both reservoirs from crashing simultaneously. The problem is that the drought has been so persistent, so severe, that both lakes are now chronically low. The system no longer has the flexibility it was designed for. The dance has become a managed fall. It is a system built for a climate that no longer exists. This is why the post-2026 negotiations are so critical. They are not just about tweaking the 2007 rules. They are about confronting the fact that the river's average flow has permanently shifted. Climate change projections from institutions like the Scripps Institution of Oceanography suggest that the river's flow could decrease by another 10 to 30% by the middle of this century. The structural deficit is going to get worse, much worse. The new rules cannot just be about sharing shortages. They must be about permanently reducing demand. And that conversation inevitably leads back to the fields of alfalfa in places like California's Imperial Valley and western Arizona. To understand the scale, consider a single acre-foot of water. It is about 326,000 gallons, enough to supply 2 to 3 average households for an entire year. A single cutting of alfalfa on a single acre in the desert can require 4 to 6 acre-feet of water. And farmers often get multiple cuttings per year. That water is applied through flood irrigation, an ancient and inefficient method where water is simply flooded across the fields. Much of it evaporates under the intense sun or seeps into the ground before the plants can use it. The economic incentives are powerful. Farmers in the Imperial Valley hold some of the most senior water rights on the entire river, dating back to the late 19th century. They pay a fraction of what cities pay for their water, and their legal right to it is nearly untouchable. Federal programs have begun paying farmers to follow their fields or switch to more efficient irrigation methods like drip systems. But the scale of the problem is immense. We are talking about converting an entire agricultural economy. The conversation is shifting. For the first time, water managers are openly discussing the need to link water use to economic value. Is it a sustainable use of a dwindling resource to grow a low-value commodity like hay in the desert? Or should that water be reallocated to support the high-value technology, tourism, and manufacturing economies of the basin cities? This is the third rail of Western water politics. It pits the foundational myth of the small farmer against the modern reality of urban economic engines. It is a battle of identity as much as it is a battle for water. Meanwhile, the physical reality in the lake continues to change. The dropping water levels are creating new threats. The Las Vegas wash, which returns Las Vegas's treated wastewater to the lake, is a critical part of the valley's water security. But as Lake Mead drops, the end of the wash becomes a waterfall, eroding the channel and threatening the stability of the wetlands and the infrastructure that carries the water. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has had to build new weirs and erosion control structures, another hidden cost of the crisis. The ecological impacts are also cascading. The cooler, deeper waters of the lake are home to native fish species like the razorback sucker, which are already endangered. As the lake shrinks and warms, their habitat is compressed, and they become more vulnerable to non-native predators like bass and catfish. The delta where the Colorado River used to meet the sea in Mexico has been a dry, cracked mudflat for decades, starved of water. The entire ecosystem of the river, from its headwaters to its ghost of a delta, is being remade by the lack of flow. The human element of the crisis is most visible at the marinas around Lake Mead. Places like Hemingway Harbor and Colville Bay have had to extend their launch ramps hundreds of yards to chase the receding water. Some marinas have been forced to close entirely, their docks left stranded high on the rocky shoreline. A multi-billion-dollar recreation industry, supporting thousands of jobs, is slowly being strangled. Houseboat owners who have moored their vessels on the lake for decades are now watching the value of their property evaporate along with the water. These local impacts are a microcosm of the larger economic threat. A 2021 study from Arizona State University estimated that a 25% reduction in Colorado River water could lead to the loss of over 500,000 jobs and billions of dollars in economic output in Arizona alone. Now multiply that across California, Nevada, and the other basin states. The numbers become staggering. A full-blown crisis on the Colorado River would trigger a regional, and likely national, economic recession. This is the weight on the shoulders of Tom Bushotsky, J.B. Hamby, and John Ensminger. They are not just fighting for water. They are fighting to prevent an economic implosion. Their May 1st, 2026 proposal, the one offering 3.2 million acre-feet of conservation, was a landmark in that fight. For the first time, the three lower basin states, historically rivals, came together on a unified plan. The proposal leans heavily on paying farmers to voluntarily follow their land and investing in more efficient irrigation technology. It also includes mandatory cuts for Arizona and Nevada if the lake continues to fall, acknowledging the physical reality. But the upper basin states see it differently. For them, the lower basin's plan is a temporary fix that doesn't address the core problem. The lower basin is still legally entitled to use more water than the river can provide. They argue that the only way to achieve long-term stability is to change the law of the river itself, to permanently reduce the lower basin's allocation. That is a red line for California, which has built its entire southern half on the promise of that water. This is the fundamental impasse. And it is a legal and political Gordian knot. The role of the federal government here cannot be overstated. Commissioner Toten's threat to act unilaterally was not a bluff. Under the law, the Secretary of the Interior has broad authority to manage the lower river to prevent waste and ensure compliance with international treaties, namely the water delivery obligations to Mexico. If the states fail, the federal government can, and likely will, step in and impose its own solution. This is the scenario that everyone wants to avoid. A federally imposed cutback would be a blunt instrument, likely favoring federal priorities over local needs and triggering years of court battles. It would represent a failure of the collaborative management that has governed the river for a century. The tools to solve this crisis exist. Widespread adoption of drip irrigation in agriculture could save millions of acre-feet. Aggressive urban conservation and water recycling following the Las Vegas model could secure supplies for cities. Desalination plants on the California coast could provide a new, drought-proof source of water, though they are expensive and energy-intensive. A grand bargain, where cities pay for agricultural efficiency improvements in exchange for a share of the saved water, is technically feasible. The problem has never been a lack of engineering solutions. It has always been a lack of political will. It is easier to pray for snow than to tell a farmer with senior water rights that his fields must go dry. It is easier to draw down a reservoir than to tell a city its growth must stop. For decades, the water in Lake Mead provided a buffer that allowed politicians to avoid these hard choices. But the buffer is almost gone. The era of avoidance is over. The final, existential question is one of value. What is the water of the Colorado River worth? Is it worth more growing alfalfa for export or supporting the tech industry in Phoenix? Is it worth more in a resort fountain in Las Vegas or sustaining a riparian ecosystem in the Grand Canyon? For 100 years, we have not had to answer those questions. The river was generous enough to support all of those demands. It is no longer. The dropping water level is a daily referendum on a century of choices. Every inch it falls is a measure of the gap between our expectations and the Earth's capacity. As of tonight, that gap is measured at 186 feet below full pool. By next summer, it could be over 200 feet. The water that filled the reservoir when Hoover Dam was dedicated in 1935 is now mostly gone, used to build an empire in the desert. The water that is left is the subject of the most intense and consequential negotiation of our time. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of the lake, the turbines at Hoover Dam spin on, their blades inching ever closer to the rough zone, and the entire system inches closer to silence.